a market analysis and economic development plan. And so I have seen Chuck speak at state conferences. He's very informative. He's also funny, but you have to watch for him. So I think you'll get a lot of information this morning. He's going to give you the highlights of the results of our marketing analysis, and then obviously we want you to be able to ask questions, okay? So Chuck Dupree, thank you.
Morning. Thank you, Paula. I've never been referred to as the chosen one before, but I'll take it. And I could certainly use that fountain of youth the way I'm feeling this morning. On the ride down from Jacksonville Beach, where I'm based, last evening, my brand new Prius, a month and a half old, broke down on I-4 just a mile into I-95. So I didn't get much sleep last night, and arrived here this morning by cab. So hopefully by 3 o'clock today, my car will be ready. I had problems. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My favorite topic, me. But no, seriously, I have worked now in, I don't know how many. I was trying to figure out over the weekend, 200 and some odd downtowns across the United States and a bunch around the state of Florida. And I do market studies, but if you just want the numbers, the raw numbers, here's the retail sales downtown, here's the amount of retail sales going out of town. You can buy that online for $50, literally, from a company called SREC. So I always was frustrated when I was a Main Street manager back in the day, way back in the day, that I'd just get these studies and they'd be larded with data, and we could never figure out how we got from the data to actually some action points and driving economic development in the downtown. So we do research, and we do a lot of original research. I'm going to talk about some of the surveys we did. But then where the rubber meets the road is, here's the damned action steps, and here's what needs to be done right now to make things happen, to drive economic development in the downtown. I take this process, I say it's akin to like what Procter & Gamble does with a tube of toothpaste. They bring in people, and they have focus groups about this toothpaste. They do survey research. They talk to dentists, and they talk to consumers, and they got all this data. But then they say, okay, now how do we improve this toothpaste to make it more attractive to the consumer? So that's really what I'm talking about. We did some research, but now how do we make the product, the end product, in this case, downtown St. Cloud, more attractive to the consumer? Let's get some of the basics out of the way. We surveyed 200 local residents by telephone. When I say local residents, I mean in the city of St. Cloud. So that is statistically significant. When you figure that Gallup uses 1,500 nationwide, 200 in one community gives you a pretty good handle on what's going on. We did 185 telephone surveys from starting in downtown Orlando out 5 miles. So that gives us that area. We did 175 in the county outside of St. Cloud. We also did focus groups with residents, now seems like a lifetime ago, I think it was back in December. I didn't do them myself, although I've seen the videotapes of them. And we did, I think we did 35 local residents and talked to them about the downtown. So some of the results, and I think to all of you, I always like to say, I wish I could uncover some major issue that nobody has thought of before, but you probably are familiar with most of the things that came forward, right? But number one, for local St. Cloud residents, people who live in this community, is that the perception is downtown is dirty and doesn't look good. That was number one. That it looks tired. And I remember in the focus groups and looking at the videotapes, people saying downtown just looks tired. It needs a facelift. Of course, not enough retail, but we hear that about any downtown. People say there's not enough retail. So, I mean, I don't think that comes as any surprise. The big thing that kind of popped out of the research was the movie theater. Now, it was a very interesting disconnect. When I talked to merchants downtown, not a single one mentioned the movie theater. Yeah, you talk to local residents, and they talk about the movie theater in the evening. And it's a major draw, and it's actually doing well. The other thing about that is it's digital. And that is a major thing today. 1% of downtowns in the United States have a movie theater. Of that 1%, only 40% right now are digital. It's a huge expense to go to digital. And you have a movie theater right in the downtown that draws at night, and yet it doesn't seem to be getting to play. There's a disconnect between what the downtown community thinks about it and what people in the community think about it. And I would say it also goes to the county, because people mentioned it. In those surveys we did from Orlando out, there was very little recognition there was even a downtown in St. Cloud. People didn't know about it. People asked questions of our surveyors who didn't know anything about it. They just take the surveys. And in the county, the perception was, I don't know, it's off the highway somewhere. That was the number, what we call 13th here, and it's got, as I've now discovered, got a million other names, depending which community you're in. People didn't have much of a recognition of downtown St. Cloud at all. So that's the data. If you're really a data junkie, when I give the final written report to Paul next week, you can go through it and look at all of the data. But I guess the other big takeaway is, besides the fact that local residents think the downtown is tired, is that there's huge retail leakage out of the community. It's about as high as we rate this from A to E. E being the most leakage that can go outside of a downtown. You're at an E. People are not, with the exception of specialty stores that are destinations, are not shopping here as a primary retail destination. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anybody, and I don't. And it isn't in most communities. We also, by the way, did intercept surveys downtown. We stopped people on the street and said, why are you here? What are you doing? Where are you shopping? A lot of them at lunchtime were city workers and people who work downtown. But the takeaway there is the same thing. They thought the downtown just didn't look good. And so across all categories of people who had familiarity with downtown, people felt that it didn't look good and that windows weren't merchandised well and by and large, that kind of thing. Now, so now we have all the data, and now the question is, how do we take the product and make it better? I have 30 years of experience in this field in downtowns. I have a pretty good handle on what works and what doesn't work. So there are some recommendations. And primary recommendation number one, you need to establish an historic district here in the downtown and make it. That could be started tomorrow. We know that people always say, well, historic preservation means I can't do anything with my building. It means I'm going to be restricted. I can't. We know that historic districts are economic development generators. There is a guy by the name of Don Ripkema who is an expert in the field. His area of expertise is historic preservation, economic development. He has written books, literally books and books, on the fact that historic preservation equals economic development, period. That is pretty well established. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, the state of Florida, in fact, Paul has got a guide that is in her office, issued by the state of Florida, that says historic preservation equals economic development. So establishing an historic district would be an economic development plus. One of the greatest assets of an historic district is you can start to use historic preservation tax credits. That's a huge deal for somebody buying a building. And you can get that, that's a 25% tax credit right off the top. So that is absolutely essential to establish that historic district. There are some, and this is on a smaller scale, I would recommend, I know Barbara Wald is coming in next month, and she's tremendous, a great speaker and a colleague, and I think the world of her. And she'll have some great tips on retailing. But I think you need a hands-on person to come in and actually work with retailers here to help merchandise the windows. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But that would go a long way to making some of those windows look better. I've got names of people that work reasonably and will come in and help do that. And no, I don't get a piece of the action. The other major recommendations falling out of this is wayfinding, because we know from the surveys that people say, well, it's just off the highway somewhere, right, the downtown. Wayfinding is just a fancy way of saying directional signage. And we in the field, as in all fields, we have to come up with fancy ways to say things to make it look like we're coming up with new ideas. But and I'm not crazy about the word wayfinding. Plus, my spell check always has it as misspelled word when I'm writing a report, but we need to be able to get around the downtown. We need directional signage here, and that just jumps off the page as one that is, it could be started tomorrow. And I know the CRA and Main Street have been talking about how to make that happen. Our recommendation is make that happen like tomorrow. There's no, I don't understand any reason for delay on that. And of course the big issue, the 600-pound gorilla, is we got a vacant hotel that's historic sitting over there at a pretty reasonable price, frankly. If you look at the numbers, and we have. If there's a private buyer, wonderful. We would encourage that. And if not, there is absolutely no reason under the sun why the city or the CRA shouldn't be acquiring that piece of property and holding it and land banking it. This is why community redevelopment agencies were established. The night before last, I actually read the enabling legislation again for the community redevelopment agencies in the state of Florida. That's a perfect example. It's almost a textbook case of what a community redevelopment agency can do. And to hold that and land bank it, it's an historic property that will drive development, for a generation if it's done well. Now, if there is a private buyer, then the role of the city and the CRA is step forward with some sort of incentive package to make sure that that is redeveloped in a way that is consistent with historic standards and guidelines and is an appropriate use. An appropriate use is probably some sort of boutique hotel, but I'll leave that all up to you. You do have, and it's going to sound like I'm jumping around on topics here, but there are, and it's interesting because this came out in the local surveys. You have a kind of a small group of critical mass, if you will, of thrift stores downtown. Now, we can all say, well, maybe we want them to go away, or we'll bring people to the downtown. And thrift stores now are, and we don't have to call them thrift stores either. Any other consignment stores, we can call them any number of things. That actually can be a great marketing tool for downtown. The other is, and I know this is one that is, but I've actually done this in a downtown, auto repair. There are some auto repair related businesses in the downtown that aren't going anywhere. And so I say let's embrace them and let's talk about this as a possibility when you come down here to get your car repaired. You can have lunch, you can shop, you can do some other things, you go to the movies, and whatever. But take that existing business cluster and go with it. I mean, you've got the major auto dealer that sits on the highway, but does extend into the core of the downtown. But there are also other auto-related businesses. And we pulled the numbers to look at sales, and that's one of the biggest draws to the downtown right now is auto repair. So we need to talk about how that is, rather than run away from it, how we embrace it. Now, there are gaps in the marketplace, and it's often people say, well, we want one of these studies. Tell us what businesses should be downtown. Well, in a downtown like this, that's often a difficult task because you can do surveys, and people will tell you what they think should be there, and then you can look at leakage, and you can see what people aren't buying. That leaves, at the end of the day, in this type of downtown, it leaves it wide open in terms of the types of businesses that can work. So what I'm suggesting is that working with the folks at the incubator, that establish a little office, and Main Street would be fine for that, a building like this would be fine for this, and call it a center of entrepreneurship. And tell people, if you want to open a business here in the community, we'll help you every step of the way. And come to us with your idea, and we will help you take that from a germ of an idea to opening a business. And this works. This works all across the country. People want to be, believe it or not, want to be asked to open a business. They want to be nurtured in that process. And I won't go into all the details here because we don't have time, but establishing a small center of entrepreneurship and marketing that regionally for very little money could very well create a dynamic set of businesses that are then filling vacant spaces. And it would seem that long term, that's really the way to go with business development here. Chains are not coming to downtowns. We know that. Chains aren't coming to any downtown. In fact, some chains have anti-downtown policies. Unless, it's a huge city like Chicago or New York or something. Even, Orlando to a certain degree. So the best way to do this is take control of it, create our own center of entrepreneurship here, let people with creative ideas come forward and open businesses. Which leads me then to, well, why here rather than Kissimmee? What's the advantage? Probably going to need to put some incentives in place. I know the CRA is a new director and trying to figure out what all the incentives are. There needs to be a downtown incentive fund. And I know Main Street has one. Probably needs to be kicked up a notch or two, so that there's an outright grant to start a business coupled with a low-interest loan. And I know banks looking for Community Reinvestment Act credit will often help set up a small loan pool, so that if you get a grant from Main Street, a grant from the CRA, then the bank is in with a loan. But that helps with that in terms of creating that idea of entrepreneurship. And I'll tell you a story about that. Actually, I've got a million stories, but there was a guy that I set up one of these programs, and there was a guy that came in to apply. And I kept arm's length. I set up a whole application committee because I didn't want to be the person deciding who was going to get into our program, get trained, and get a loan and grant at the end. And this guy comes in and he's got no teeth. And I said, oh boy, here we go. We got a guy came in 4 teeth and he's going to open a business. So it was maybe about 8 months after we trained him, and he'd gotten his grant. And he came in and stood next to my desk. And I said, hey, John, what's going on? And he went like this. And I said, oh, great, you got teeth. He said, yeah, business is actually taking off. There was a camera shop that he opened. And he did repairs, and nobody else was doing repairs. And so all of a sudden he had teeth. I thought, this is a good sign. A year later, he bought his building that he'd been renting. 2 years after that, he bought the building next door. He owned half the block as of about 4 years ago. And he just sold for a substantial amount of money to a major developer out of Boston. So starting with just that little germ of an idea, we saw some entrepreneurship that helped define a downtown. Another person went through that same program. I actually got actively involved. And it was chastised by my assistant because I said, I don't want to decide who's getting involved. So I was walking by her desk. I saw the application woman. I said, I don't think this business is going to work. My assistant said, I thought you were going to stay out of this. And I said, all right, I guess I was. And it's a good thing that I did because it was a gingerbread business. I thought that's too seasonal. That's kind of like Christmas time kind of stuff. And that woman now has several stores and a couple of warehouses. And is distributing not only nationally but internationally gingerbread products. And so the idea is we can drive entrepreneurship and reach out to people and say, if you want to open a business in downtown St. Cloud, we'll help you every step of the way. That will go a long way toward creating a sense of dynamic economics within the downtown. It is probably the easiest way to do it. Now, one thing I would suggest, I know Paul has probably heard me talk about this at conferences, but too few communities do it. You really want to jumpstart a business downtown, do a business plan competition. Banks love to sponsor these. I know we have a banker in the room. He's probably saying, no, we really don't like to sponsor these things. But banks actually do like to sponsor these events, and local businesses. You come up $5,000 or $10,000, advertise and say, the person with the best business plan, we're going to give an outright grant to open a business. And it is a great way to control the mix downtown. Kissimmee is looking at doing this, by the way. So maybe you ought to get ahead of them on this one. It's a great way to control the mix. It's a great way to get publicity. People love these kind of contests, and it's a great way to put a really strong business person, because you get to review the business plan on the front end, into the heart of the downtown. So it takes a little creative thinking in terms of entrepreneurship and driving these types of things. But it's a creative idea that is now working all across the country. The previous economic development director here had a great idea as well, and I think there's something to this. Also looking at potential long-term, I think this is a long-term idea, but I think it's something that makes some sense in terms of food processing. Downtown, a lot of downtowns are becoming centers of food and culinary arts and food processing. You've got a relatively rural agrarian economy outside of town, between here and going east, and there is the need for food processing and food processing related businesses. There's space downtown, and I think the new CRA director is very creative and very tied into what's going on, kind of marrying that need along with the fact that those businesses are out there makes some sense. The other thing I would mention is, and I know Paul is going to love this one, special events in terms of improving the product. You got a great one coming up this Friday, and you got Ponce de Leon and all this other business going on. But there was a sense, and I think it doesn't mean you need to do more special events, but in the surveys locally, there was a sense there wasn't a lot going on downtown. Not a lot of activity, not a lot of special events, nothing to do beyond going down to a specialty store or a thrift store, and then, that's it. So maybe it's a matter of marketing, just picking up the marketing a little bit in terms of what special events are actually taking place. I would be remiss if I didn't come back to the historic district, because this is something that can happen soon. It's just a matter of writing the application, establishing the boundaries. And I really cannot tell you, I'm an economic development person. I'm a downtown economic development person. Absent an historic district, you will never get the type of economic development downtown that you really want. And I can state that almost unequivocally. The most dynamic downtowns in the state of Florida, the most dynamic downtowns across the United States have historic districts. And that process probably, could with the city's assistance and Main Street's assistance and the state's assistance, because they have experts that do this, a process could start like tomorrow. And I think, if we're talking about the hotel, that ties into all of that, and it all becomes one big package. So, in summary, people think downtown looks tired, needs a facelift. They don't think there's a lot going on. They don't know how to get around downtown from the highway. And there is a sense, I think, that there's been some neglect of downtown over the years. I read something that one public official said in the newspaper about, in fact, maybe we should just ignore downtown and look elsewhere for a while. That is the wrong way to go. Economic development is wonderful in a community, but downtown is the fabric, it's the heart and soul of the community. To ignore downtown would be to ignore long-term economic growth in the community. So I would implore everybody to pay attention to downtown and the economic growth that takes place there. So those are my highlights. For those of you that are sadists, or masochists, I should say, you can read the full report when it's released next week. And if you have trouble sleeping at night, that should help you along with that process a little bit too. So, and I will come back to the community, and I will do full PowerPoint presentation. I would have done a PowerPoint this morning, except my assistant told me that would put people to sleep after we ran through it the other night. So I said I better just hit the highlights and let it go at that. With that, I'd like to take some questions. Yes?